Okay, welcome everyone. This is the first ESS lecture of the spring 2021 semester. And as you note, this is on Zoom, so this is new for us. Our first speaker, our guinea pig, is Daniel Nettle at Newcastle University. I've known Daniel for 15 years, maybe more, I don't know.
I think it's a lot more than that, Karthik. Let's not count.
Could be. Okay, it's been a while.
Yeah.
We've published together and we are quite good friends. I'm really excited to have him speak. He embodies a lot of the principles that I think I would like ESS to be, in particular, very interdisciplinary and bridging evolutionary sciences and the social and behavioral sciences. He's in a department at Newcastle, which I think combines psychologists and biologists, which is an example of the kind of thing that we're after. And today he's going to be talking about people in poverty as perhaps being acting adaptively. So please welcome Daniel Nettle, do your virtual hand claps or whatever. And after the lecture, we'll do Q&A. We'll figure out how that goes, but I'll just let Daniel speak.
Thank you very much, Karthik. It's lovely to see you. And just for my orientation, are you now seeing my title slide on your screens?
Yes.
Okay, great. So if at any point it doesn't advance or I'm not showing you the right screen or something, please, or I'm inaudible, please just indicate, because obviously it's you don't get much feedback kind of speaking into a camera in your bedroom. So anyway, it's lovely to be here and to speak with you all. I'm hoping to present some quite controversial or thought-provoking material. It's not just my research, it's some bits and pieces from mine and other people's research to sort of make a case about people in poverty and their behavior that I hope will lead to some discussion, and I hope we can have a good discussion session afterwards. So this is actually derived from a talk that was called "Seeing People in Poverty as Rational Actors," which was really mainly aimed at economists and sociologists or people in public health. I've sort of changed it a bit to seeing people in poverty as adaptive actors, because I think everyone here is probably interested in evolutionary and adaptive explanations. And rational and adaptive have something in common. That's to do with kind of behavior being oriented towards a goal in some sort of efficient way. But of course, they're not synonyms with one another. And so if I slip a bit back and forth between saying this is rational and this is adaptive, I do know there's a tension there. I do know there's an unsolved sort of problem in my work, but hopefully we'll have some discussion of that as the talk goes by. So the talk's about seeing people in poverty as either rational actors, if you like it that way, or adaptive actors, if you like it the other way, and we'll talk about the relationship between those two claims anon. Okay, so I'm really talking about people who live in poverty within affluent Western societies like the US or the UK or European nations, things like that. That's primarily, when I talk about people in poverty, that's really who I have in mind. Though I think many of these arguments would work to people in other societies as well. But that's the data I'm going to sort of draw on. So people in poverty behave in really very different ways from people within the same societies who are not facing poverty. I mean, these differences are often very large. They're often larger than the differences between countries, right? So the poor in England, which is quite a small country, behave differently from the rich by a bigger margin than the average person in England behaves from the average person in India in lots of ways. Okay, so the within society poverty-related variation is generally very big. And of course, social scientists sort of wonder about this, what it means, what its implications are, what to do about it. So for example, people who live in poverty have their children at a much, much younger age than affluent people who often live just a few city blocks away. They eat different food, right? So when you hear about kind of eating junk food and relying on a lot of sugary beverages and things of that nature, you're often talking about people who live in poverty, whose behavior is really quite markedly different from the diet of university professors or whoever else. And on lots of kind of psychological tasks like delay of gratification, you see these differences between the rich and the poor. So people living in poverty are less likely to forego one marshmallow now for 2 marshmallows down the line. And this is quite a sort of replicable finding in various ways in various different samples. So there are all these differences. And I think a very standard approach, certainly in public health and in some other social sciences, perhaps health psychology as well, is to assume that people in poverty get it wrong. It's to assume they just make dumb decisions, right? They just eat food that really isn't good for you, or they're impulsive, so they can't stop themselves, grabbing that one marshmallow now, or they don't know about birth control, and so they're poorly educated about that, or they just make errors because they're in emotional turmoil or stressed or something, and therefore end up having falling pregnant at a young age and so on. So underlying all of these, quite insidiously, actually, all of these sort of views of people in poverty is people in poverty just get stuff wrong. You need to give them better information, you need to support them, you need to teach them better decision making, but fundamentally they get things wrong. And a lot of my research starts from a different point of view, which says, what if they just get things right? What if this is actually the right thing to do if you find yourself in that situation? Of course, that raises the question of right with respect to what maximand, right? And of course, that's where the big issues lie. But I think it's worth taking seriously the hypothesis that where people in poverty behave in systematically different ways from people in affluence, they might not be all getting it wrong all the time. There might be patterned, sensible reasons why they're doing the things they're doing. Not, of course, that people in poverty get things right all the time. Neither do people who are very rich. They do dumb things all the time as well. So, but on average, the pattern's difference may not be the result of mass error or poor decision making, but something else. And I'll try and sort of illustrate that thesis through some case studies. So this general line of work, which I've been doing for about a decade, really has two sources of inspiration. So one is the discipline of economics. I'm not sure, that I fully buy into the kind of microeconomic rational choice worldview in terms of a theory of human behavior, but it certainly is clear and consistent about what its assumptions are in a way I find very helpful. So there are great examples from the history of economic theory of people who've written about apparently deviant or maladaptive behaviors and said, let's not assume that people are getting things wrong, but let's assume they do it for a reason, right? They're kind of being rational actors in some way. So I'm thinking particularly of the work of Gary Becker, who has a Nobel Prize in economics, who looks at things like committing crime, and rather than saying these are people who've got poorly developed frontal lobes who just can't control their impulses, says, well, under what conditions might it make sense to commit a crime? And it turns out to depend on things like opportunity costs and what legitimate sources of resources are available to you, and your human capital, and a whole lot of things that actually make pretty sensible predictions about who commits crime and when. And he even goes further to things like addiction, which we tend to think of as just bad decision making, just pathology, and says, well, no, there might be situations where it'd be perfectly rational to become addicted to something. If the things you're going to lose through your addiction are, don't have a very high value anyway, and the payoff from the addictive enjoyment is very big, and so on. So he gives a really radical rational actor approach to behaviors that psychologists always go, that just must be something wrong. That's just people who are making bad decisions. So economists are at least kind of thoroughgoingly self-consistent about these things. They don't assume pathology. Where they see behavior, they assume rational action. And I'm not saying I really necessarily agree with their conclusions, but I think it's a bracing style of thinking. My other big source of inspiration is animal behavioral ecology. So I've been doing research on starlings, and one of the things we know about the starlings is when conditions are adverse, for example, when the ground is very dry in the spring and they can't get the soil invertebrates that they really like out of the ground, they start eating other stuff. They start to eat grains. They go into pig farms and take the pig pellets. And we don't say to them, oh, these starlings, they're eating junk food. We've got to educate them about how to eat healthily, right? We've got to give them information that junk food's not good for you. What we say is, these are pretty smart animals, right? They've survived for countless generations. If they're shifting systematically to a different kind of food, it's probably to do with constraints in their ecology, and it's probably in some sense an adaptive response. So there's a whole bunch of theory in behavioral ecology about actually when you should eat crap, right? When you should eat stuff that's not very good for you, when other stuff is not available to you at a reasonable cost, then as long as it's better than nothing, you should actually switch. You should have a broader tolerance of different diets and so on. And that could be perfectly adaptive if you're operating under constraints. And of course, lots of things in behavioral ecology that on the face of it don't make any sense, like senescing, your body falling apart because you haven't maintained it and then you dying, actually can be selected for, right? So this is an argument that goes right back to George C. Williams, that even something as apparently maladaptive as dying, allowing unrepaired damage to accumulate in your body, could actually be selected for, right? His particular argument is still controversial even now, 70 years on, but the general principle that things that don't look very good for you could actually be adaptive strategies if there are certain kinds of constraints and hazards in the environment is really well established in behavioral ecology. So when behavioral ecologists look at a behavior, they don't sort of say, oh, there's a load of individuals getting it wrong. Their explanation of first recourse is maybe there's an adaptive reason for it. Okay, so the structure of my talk today, I've got these 3 case studies: age of childbearing, poor diet, and preventative health behaviors, which all illustrate this general thesis of people in poverty doing things that from a middle class point of view seem a bit odd, but when you actually start to think about them, make quite a lot of sense. And then I want to talk more generally about some speculations about both the causes of our persistent view that seems to be current in society, that that people in poverty make bad decisions, and actually implications of the revisionist view that maybe their decisions aren't always so bad. And then we'll have some time for discussion. Okay, so let's start with my first case study, which is age of childbearing. This is something I started working on. It was really the first topic I worked on in this kind of arena back a decade ago. So poverty, or some sort of socioeconomic position variable, is a really strong predictor of when the age at which a woman will bear her first child. So this is data from England. The neighborhood quality score is a measure of basically the wealth of the people in that neighborhood, the wealth and resources of the neighborhood, and it's in deciles from 10 is the richest neighborhoods of the whole country. The country is divided into 47,000 neighborhoods as far as national statistics are concerned, through to 1, which is the very poorest neighborhoods in the country. So this is a neighborhood level measure of wealth and resources. And you look at the mean age of women falling pregnant for the first time in those neighborhoods, and you see an incredibly clear pattern, right? So there's pretty much a decade from the poorest neighborhoods to the richest that systematically and in a graded way you go down. As you go down the wealth gradient, you get earlier childbearing. And of course, if on average people are starting at 22, that means quite a lot of women are starting in their teens. Some later, some earlier. There's obviously a scatter around the mean. So you might look at that and say, well, as indeed actually a former government of the UK did, basically look at this data and say, well, the women in these 3 poorest deciles, that's where there's the so-called teen pregnancy problem. They need to be stopped from doing that. We need a national strategy to stop them doing this. And in fact, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, which partly sort of inspired this work, the UK spent many millions of pounds in trying to persuade young women in poor areas not to have babies young. Okay, which is interesting, right? So we live in a liberal society where people can allegedly do what they want as long as they're adults. So it's interesting we spent millions of pounds trying to persuade them not to do what they wanted. I think the first kind of thing you'd need to show would be if you could show that the women who have their first babies young in those poor neighborhoods were systematically making mistakes or doing things they came to regret, then you'd have some case for intervention, right? But in fact, we were able to show, and many other people have also shown, that by and large, early childbearing is a goal. It doesn't happen to people by accident in Western affluent societies. People who have babies at a young age, who fall pregnant at a young age, are usually trying to do so. So this is one study where we showed it. This is a study where, as it happened, a cohort of women had been asked at 16, what do you think is an ideal age to have your first baby? And then had been followed until they were in their 40s. So we knew at what age they actually had their first baby. And of course, we used some measures of socioeconomic position as well. So the first thing to say is the age at which they actually had their babies was massively socially patterned in the way that you would think. The second thing is that their response to the question, what's the ideal age, was also socially patterned in the way that you would think. So the poorer the neighborhood they came from, the earlier they thought was ideal to have a baby. And moreover, the age that they had pre-registered when they were 16 as being ideal was an extremely good predictor of when they actually did it. Okay, so this is just a little bit of data from that paper. And actually what it shows is that women who have a baby when they're 16, 17, 18 years old, their problem is that the problem is not that they've made a mistake and got pregnant too early. Their problem is that by their own lights, they haven't got pregnant early enough, right? So women who are aiming for 16, 17 or 18 actually averaged about 20. So they overshot their target by a couple of years. I guess it's hard to organize getting pregnant at short notice, but you know, so the idea that there's sort of mass mistakes, that people are falling pregnant with no idea that this leads to reproduction or it's something they might want to do, just does not seem to be supported by this and other sources of data. Generally speaking, people have early fertility where that's normative in their communities and they express actually an endorsement that it's a good thing. So I think that's an important sort of bit of data in this. Okay, but let's think about the ecological problem that you're trying to solve as a parent. One of the things that's very different between neighborhoods of different levels of wealth is that your expectation of healthy life is really dramatically different. So in the poorest neighborhoods of England, your expectation of healthy life, if you're a woman, is at least a decade shorter, actually a bit more than that, than the rich neighborhoods. So it would sort of be odd if that didn't affect the timing of your other life history choices, right? So I just did a very simple thing in this paper about 10 years ago now and said, for each decile of neighborhood, let's calculate the age at which you would need to start your reproductive career if you wanted to satisfy the following heuristic, which is, I want to be still in good health until my oldest grandchild is 5 years old. Okay, so let's assume that you kind of came to the view that that would be quite a good strategy, and you'd have to assume also that your child was going to themselves start reproducing at the same age as you. I built that into the assumption. So what is the latest age I can wait to, consistent with the goal of still being in good health on average, given the expectation of life in my neighborhood, when my oldest grandchild is 5. And on this graph, the solid line shows the latest you could afford to wait to satisfy that heuristic for different deciles of neighborhood affluence in Britain. And the dots show the actual observed averages from national data for those things. And as you can see, it's a pretty good fit, right? So really, the people who you know, in the very poorest neighborhoods who are starting at 22 on average, their expectation of healthy life is only about 50. Okay, they don't die at 50, but their health declines rapidly on average. So it's actually not a bad idea that you're really not going to want to wait to 30, right? If you want to satisfy an heuristic like this. Now, of course, I decided that was the heuristic I wanted to model. I could have decided another one. So there's a lot of researcher degrees of freedom there. But the point is, it's not a stupid one. When I say to people intuitively, that make sense as a sort of adaptive strategy, people say, well, yeah, I can imagine that people might use a heuristic like that to make their decisions. And all I'm showing here is that the things people do fit the heuristic pretty well. There's no evidence of sort of mass error on the average. We'll come back to these kind of claims, but that just gives you a flavor of my sort of general argument about age of childbearing. I'll now move on to my second case study. Okay, so my second case study is about poor diet. And it's not my work. I'm really drawing here on the work of Nicole Darmon, who's a French nutrition scientist whose work I think is extremely interesting. So we know that people in poverty are much less likely to eat so-called healthy foods and much more likely to eat so-called junk foods. So, you know, sugary beverages, white bread, you know, these kinds of things. And less likely to eat fruit and vegetables, you know, lean meat, fresh fish, and all those kinds of things. Okay. So one of the things that Darmon has shown very nicely is just that if you think about the energy cost, so the number of euros per megajoule or per kilocalorie of energy that you get from different foods, the foods that we call healthy, and indeed are healthy, in the societies we live in, are orders of magnitude more expensive per calorie. So if you want to get 1,000 calories from leafy vegetables and fresh fish, you have to spend many euros. Whereas if you want to get 1,000 calories from white bread, cheap jam, and sugar-sweetened beverages, it costs you a few cents. We're talking orders of magnitude different. So when we ask people in poverty to stop doing what they're doing and eat more healthy foods, you have to appreciate we're asking them to buy foods that are many orders of magnitude more expensive if you want to fill yourself with a certain number of calories a day. So that's interesting, right? And just, before we come to the conclusion that, well, people in poverty are just really badly informed about what's healthy, don't forget the one resource that these people really lack, which is money. You need a lot more of it to eat healthily than eat less healthy. So the foods with the lowest energy costs are those that are deemed unhealthy, whereas healthy foods cost a lot more per calorie. So here's the really clever thing. I think this study is superb. It's an epidemiological study. It's worth me just explaining in some detail. So what the researchers did in this study is they worked out how much, this is a study from the Paris metropolitan area from about 25 years ago now. They worked out how many euros a day were people spending on food, and what was the breakdown of the major food groups, cereals, dairies, fats, fruit and veg, and so on, that made up the number of calories. And so they spent about €4.5 a day, and the average diet, the observed diet in the population, had this breakdown of the different food groups, as shown by the vertical height of the different points here. That's the number of calories that came from each food group per day. And then what the researchers did was, given the prices of these foods, they created a linear programming model that they set the goal of, firstly, achieve the same number of calories per day as the average diet. That's the diet at the left there. And get as close as you can possibly get to the balanced breakdown of the different food groups that is shown in the average diet. But we're going to give you progressively less and less money to spend per day to do it, right? In silico, right? This is a model, it's a theoretical model. So how close could you get? What could you do if you only had €4 a day instead of 4.5? And what if only 3 instead of 4.5? And what if only 2 instead of 4.5? And the hard constraint here is that every diet shown in this figure is isocaloric, contains the same number of calories. But what you do is the cost constraint bites. You have to abandon the relatively expensive categories, or you have to sacrifice the relatively expensive categories of food, and you have to depart in order to satisfy your cost constraint and the hard constraint of having to have enough calories per day. You have to sacrifice the expensive food groups and substitute some of the cheap ones. So you violate more and more of the soft constraints of keeping the balance of food groups the same. And what this shows, remember, this is theoretical predictions, this is not observed data, is really, really interesting, that as you impose the cost constraint more and more harshly, the diet shifts in the actual ways that are observed with people who are living in poverty, really in quite detailed ways. So the proportion of the diet from cereals goes up, fruit and veg really drops out, meat and fish drops out. And as the cost constraint becomes really harsh, things like sweets, sugar sweetened beverages and just candy and so on actually start to contribute a fair amount. And what they then go on to show is, if you look at the behavior of actual people in poverty, this model really explains what they're doing pretty well. So all you need to know about them to predict the shopping behavior and the foraging behavior of people living in poverty is how, is what their cost constraint is. If you know that they've got a cost constraint, you can actually predict how they'll deviate from the sort of typical diet of that society, really very, very accurately. And this model has no ignorance, it has no mistakes, it has no poor education about the nutritional value of foods. It's just driven by the need to get enough calories in and the need to do it as cheaply as your cost constraints allow. And you make really specific predictions about how the diets of the poor will differ from the rich, that turn out to be pretty accurate for this population. Now you may say, well, yeah, but this is odd, because it's why, in all of the diets in this are isocaloric. So the model is maintaining the number of calories a day, whilst doing so at lower and lower cost, as the cost constraint is made increasingly harsh. But you say, well, but that's not the problem, because you may think that that poor people actually eat more calories a day. That's why they're more prone to be obese in countries like the US and the UK. But actually, there's no evidence that that's true. People in poverty do not eat more calories, as far as we know, per day than people who are more affluent. And the reasons that they tend to be more obese do not seem to include that they eat more calories. People often find that counterintuitive, because they have a very entrenched belief that people are fatter because they eat more calories, and therefore if low SES people are fatter, it must be because they're eating more calories. In fact, this is not the case. There is no association. This is a paper of ours from last year, or 2 years ago now. There is no association in a vast nationally representative US data set, the N-Haynes, between the number of calories people eat per day and how fat they are. Zero. Because actually adiposity is a pretty complex thing, and just counting the number of calories in, that's not what determines levels of adiposity. So this is self-report data. I mean, the weights and heights are measured, but the food consumption is self-report. But nonetheless, we don't know of any systematic evidence that low SES people eat more calories on average, or do so disproportionately to their energy expenditure, nor that that's the reason why they tend to be obese. Okay, and one more sort of, so what predicts higher BMI for women anyway is not how many calories they consume. It's actually other things like low food diversity and temporal variability in food intake at the statistical level is what seems to predict being obese. So one other thing, not only do we know that if you model the effect of a cost constraint, you get diets that look like the diets that are actually consumed by people in poverty, but we also know that if you make food groups cheaper, people in poverty, the healthy food groups, people in poverty consume more of them. So when there are randomized control trials of food subsidies, or subsidies for particular types of food groups like fruit and vegetables, what you find is, hey presto, in real time, people respond and they start eating more healthy food. Okay, so all you have to do is give them the money or make the foods cheaper, and they just do this. And which is very interesting, because in public health, there are lots of people who say, oh, well, getting people to eat healthily is incredibly hard, and you have to give them dietary education, and you have to label the foods, and you actually, if you just change the prices of them, people switch from eating unhealthy foods to healthier ones. And I won't explain this randomized control trial in detail, but basically, the poorer the people were to start with, the more the intervention allowed them to actually eat more fruit and vegetables, for example. So there's no real mystery here. We know how to make people eat more healthily, which is give them more money. And people who are rich already eat more healthily, and there could be something causal going on there. Okay, so in randomized control trials, altering price alters consumption pretty effectively, actually. Okay, and I'll just go on to my third case study, which is about preventative health behavior. When I mean preventative health behavior, I mean things like going for medical checkups, which are free in this country, so that the reason people don't go is not generally a cost one. Wearing your seatbelt, following advice on medication, following dietary guidelines of other kind, not smoking, these kinds of things. Okay, so it's really, really well observed that people in poverty don't adhere to these things, even when those things are costless, as much as people who are richer. And this is sort of seems like a cruel irony. People who are already being dealt a pretty tough hand by life, have already got all these challenges, and then they further don't look after themselves in the ways that they actually could. That just seems a sort of cruel double blow or an irony. And this really is drawing the work on the work of my former student, Gillian Pepper. And Gillian's argument is kind of well summarized in this cartoon shown here on the screen. There's two soldiers, there are bombs going off overhead. One of the soldiers is lighting up a pipe. The other one says, geez, John, don't you listen? Sarge says drugs are dangerous. Well, of course, that provokes the intuition immediately that if there were bombs going off, the long-term health effects of drugs, really would not be something that concerned you terribly much at all. And that's the spirit of this kind of argument. So I do have a formal model to this effect, and what the model shows is that it would make sense in a world where bad things are happening that were beyond your control. It would make sense to invest less in sorting out the things that are within your control, because some of that would turn out to be wasted investment, that you'd get blown up by a bomb long before the long-term health effects of the drugs would affect you. I'll just talk you really quickly through the spirit of this model, but we don't need to worry about the details. So in this model, agents are trying to maximize their life expectancy, and their life expectancy is affected by two things. Firstly, this thing we call extrinsic mortality. So bombs can just go off at a certain rate and they take you out. There's nothing you can do about it if they happen. And secondly, the second sort of source of your mortality is your own health behavior, how much you invest in looking after your health. And the basic insight of the model really is that so the rate of these extrinsic mortality threats is given by this parameter m. So if m is small, if m is 0, you'll never be hit by a bomb, and if m is 1, you'll be hit by a bomb in the first year, definitely. And obviously we look at values that are somewhere between. The basic insight of this model is that the payoff, the expected value of investments, of health behaviors, investments in your own future health, really depends on the rate of this extrinsic mortality thing. So if that's high, as in the m equals 0.03 on this screen, then the payoff for you investing in your future health is much lowered by the fact that you'll probably be hit by a bomb before the effects really land. Whereas if that m is very low, then you get a much bigger payoff. The expected value of those investments is much, much bigger. And as a consequence of that, the optimal amount, so we assume that you have to give up something in the immediate term to invest in future health behavior. And there's something sort of Calvinistic and self-abnegating about it. And actually we show that the optimal amount to invest in your future health behavior, if there is that trade-off, really depends on this extrinsic mortality thing, m. So if m is high, it's just not worth investing in things that have a health payoff many years into the future, because something else will probably have got you soon, before then. So this can appear like a somewhat circular argument. If mortality is high, you don't look after yourself, so mortality is high. But we're not saying that. What we're saying is if the uncontrollable component of mortality is high, it makes rational sense to invest less in the controllable component, even though that's something you could in principle control. And this means that when you have an improvement in the safety of living, you get this kind of double dividend. And that's actually been observed historically. So if you make people's environments safer, firstly, that's good for them because their environments are now safer. But secondly, you'd expect they'd respond behaviorally, because they'd say, well, hang on, my prospects are pretty good here. I better start investing in my future health. And this is what we see with middle class people, particularly since the Second World War in countries like the UK. As their general prospects have improved, they've actually become much more health conscious and really, very compliant with medication and very worried about not smoking and all sorts of things, precisely because, they've now got an asset to protect. They've got really good prospects, and they really want to kind of maximize that. And essentially what you see, particularly people living in concentrated poverty that still exists within societies like the UK and the US, is people who haven't had that double dividend yet. Right? So they haven't had the first dividend yet, and they're not really responding with the second. So I think this can explain a lot about some of the social differences in health in investments. There's an old joke, I can't remember who it's attributed to, but there's a saying, if I'd known I was going to live this long, I would have looked after myself better. And that really captures the spirit of this model quite well. What this suggests, by the way, is that the locus of intervention might not be obvious, right? If you want to get people to stop smoking, you could say to them, smoking is really bad, you'll probably die of it. Or you could say to them, actually, you know what? Your life prospects are really good. There are good jobs out there, and infectious disease, pandemics notwithstanding, has declined, and there are all kinds of reasons for thinking you'll live a long time. And the implication is that will be more likely to have an effect on people's behavior, because then they think, well, hang on here. If I'm actually have the potential to live a long time, I really ought to look after myself better. Okay, so those were my 3 kind of brief case studies. I hope that they were clear. I just want to spend a couple of minutes on an unsolved problem in this line of work, which relates to that thing I said on the outset about whether we're seeing this as a rational choice model or an adaptive evolutionary model. So what I've shown in my case studies is that people in poverty who, on the face of it, seem to be making kind of poor decisions might actually be doing quite well with respect to some goal, like having a child in time to still be in good health by the time your grandchildren are born, or at least getting the right number of calories in per day if you haven't got much money, or making the optimal trade-off between present enjoyment and future health, given the environment you live in. And I tend in my papers to say, well, these are adaptive strategies. But of course, adaptive, what it really means, if you think of the price equation or something, is co-varies with fitness. And I certainly can't show you that choosing to eat, sugar-sweetened beverages and frozen pizza because you're poor co-varies with fitness. I can only show you that it relates to some proxy that you might reasonably think would be the kind of proxy that an evolved animal might be concerned to do, like making sure it got enough calories in a day. But this is quite common in behavioral ecology, right? We don't actually measure fitness for many things. For example, foraging theory, we measure some short-term immediate proxy, something that we think the animal might be kind of responding to or trying to maximize. And I think my choice of proxies for my 3 examples are probably not absurd ones, but they're not very principled, right? So it seems to me that in all of these different things, we end up choosing different proxies and kind of saying, look, with respect to this proxy, this behavior seems quite sensible. But there's no kind of pre-registration of which proxy should be relevant to which behavior, for example. And I think that's a real problem with behavioral ecology. I also think that although I often use kind of arguments about optimality and maximization informally in my work, I don't really believe people are strict maximizers of anything. I think much more likely they're using some kind of rules of thumb or, habits that, that are transmitted or whatever, some pattern that's not too bad, not as bad as some of the alternatives with respect to some kind of reasonable life-related maximum or outcome. But I don't actually believe they're strict maximizers, nor do I believe it's possible to say really in advance what is the set of things that human beings try to optimize or try to maximize. We don't really know what that set is a priori, so we tend to make these ad hoc arguments, different ones for different domains. Maybe this is something we want to come back to in discussion. But instead, I'll spend the next few minutes just talking about some sort of implications of this. So the first thing is, isn't it odd that we look at these people who live amongst us, that's people living in poverty, and we kind of systematically say, look, they're just making terrible decisions. We really need to intervene on their decisions and help them make better decisions. Isn't it odd when we don't do that, when we look at the birds in our garden, whose brains weigh 2 grams, and when they change their diet or change their reproductive behavior, we don't say, oh, they're making bad decisions. Like we say, well, they're probably doing something adaptive because they're smart, evolved organisms. Isn't it odd that people are in our own society, we will be more prejudiced about the decisions of than, and indeed, we're often, in anthropology, when we look at distant populations doing some odd thing, we go, oh, there must be some reason in their ecology they're doing it this way. But for some reason, we don't seem to easily apply the same generosity of interpretation to people who live in the same cities as we do. And I think this is really odd. I've been puzzling over this for a few years now, and the only thing I can make of it is that people have this thing I call context blindness. So when I see someone snatching a marshmallow or falling pregnant at 18 or going into Pizza Addict to get their dinner, I kind of can't really get my head around their context. What I think is, if I were to do that, given my context, would I be making a good decision? And I would not be making a good decision if I went to Pizza Addict tonight, given that I can afford, a better dinner. And I would not probably be making the decision in my context, the right decision, if I took short-term rewards rather than delaying gratification for larger later ones. So somehow, because people are so familiar to us, and because the contexts of choice are so familiar to us, we kind of struggle to really understand that other people in our own society actually, are living, although in the same physical space as us, with very, very different contexts. So much so that when I give this talk, people often say, are you really saying that people in Newcastle are too poor to have enough money to buy good food? And I said, yes, I really am saying that. And there's really good evidence that it's actually true. You should not be surprised about that. But people say, yeah, but they're not really that poor. It's like, yeah, they really are. There's actually really good evidence that's the case. There's a kind of incredulity we have to the fact that other people in our midst would have such a different context from us when they look like us, they dress like us, and they inhabit the same high streets as us. And similarly, there's something going on here with a kind of fundamental attribution error, that when we see someone snatching a marshmallow or, deciding to have a family young or whatever, we kind of default to an explanation in terms of their dispositions. There's something wrong with them, rather than seeing the situation, which is actually what might be the genuine driver. So I think it's odd that the kind of perspective on people in poverty that I've made today is not just more uncontroversial. It should be, but yet when I give this talk, people say, God, do you really think that? And then just, I won't sort of go on too much longer, but I'll just say that the big implication of this is in terms of interventions, right? Do you want to intervene on teenage pregnancy, dissuade people in poverty from having their babies young, or do you want to persuade people to buy kale instead of Coke? Or is that even a sensible thing to be doing, right? So people in public health certainly believe it is, right? So they have all these interventions which are to change the choices of people in poverty without changing the underlying context, the underlying ecology in which those people are operating. And actually, sometimes those interventions seem to do something. Sometimes it's possible that they're even ethically ill-advised, right? Because you're trying to make people do things that maybe in their ecology don't make a whole lot of sense. And very often they're ineffective anyway, right? So, and then people go, oh, behavior is really hard to change, isn't it? It's like, well, yeah, that's like pushing a rock is really hard if you push it up a hill, but if you push it down a hill, it turned out to be extremely easy, right? So if you don't understand the context, you might come up with all these interventions and sort of say, well, that didn't really work. God, behavior change is a hard thing. But I think, if you understand the reasons why people are doing things, then behavior change, it starts to be less clear that you're choosing the right target, and also why what you're doing should even work in the first place. But of course, I don't say that it's good to be a person in poverty, or all the outcomes associated with that are good. They're not, they're terrible, right? There are huge inequalities in things like healthy life expectancy. So with my colleagues, Matthew and Elliot Johnson, we've been writing about, if you really want interventions that make sense and are going to work, how far upstream do you have to go? Do you have to go further upstream than giving people education about birth control, to why they might be wanting to have babies young in the first place? And actually, what is the appropriate level of upstream to go? And maybe do you have to actually go all the way upstream to the existence of poverty in the first place, right? Why is there poverty? What is the level of the poverty of uncertainty people are responding to? And is the ultimate intervention, the effective one, the one that, does all the things you want it to do, is it in fact just relieving poverty and forgetting about all of the kind of downstream tinkering that you might want to do? And we just made that argument, or attempted to start making that argument in a paper in the Journal of Public Health, which is shown there. And that's an incomprehensible diagram, which is figure 1 of that paper, which all social scientists should have a good diagram like that. Utterly illegible, many arrows going from many boxes. But I think we're just making the basic point here that you deal with the poverty problem and a lot of things flow downstream from that. Okay, that's just a couple of references. This is work I've been doing on and off in different ways for a number of years, but that's the two most kind of recent takes on my thinking on this. One with my former student, Gillian Pepper, one with my friend and colleague, who's also Karthik's friend and colleague, Willem Frankenhaus. And I'll stop there, and I hope we'll have time for questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. And let me also plug the rest of the series. Those of you that are here should be on our email list. Our next talk is March 8th, I believe, Jim Sedanius at Harvard, social psychologist. And then the following talk in April will actually be Willem Frankenhaus, talking about related matters to this. So with that, I'll leave it open for questions. I think the easiest way is, if you know how to, use your virtual hand signal. If not, just go ahead and unmute and speak. But I think we can manage. There's not too many of us. So whoever would like to start. Andre, I guess a real hand would work as well if your camera is on. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Andre Ari. I'm in the Department of Philosophy at Mizzou. I was really interested in some of the theoretical things that you were discussing at the end in terms of context blindness and trying to figure out categories of how to think about this issue. Because throughout the talk, I was thinking about different categories of thinking about the work. You were talking about, so what I'm going to say is probably, it's just, I'm trying to see how you would react to help me think this through. It's not a criticism at all. Is I was thinking about, you kept saying something about choice, that something is sensible, the choice is sensible or adaptive. But there might be another context in which you're actually not thinking of those normative ways of thinking, but just thinking about what the causes are, just as you said earlier, proximate causes for something. And here we're in the realm of couldn't have done otherwise. So choice is sort of out of it. And so maybe that would affect, I was thinking about this, affect how you would react to people's behavior towards poor food choices. It's not no longer a poor food choice, but it's determined. It's determined because of social pressure. It's determined because of unfettered capitalism that provides conditions where real food deserts occur and crap food is located near them. And that seemed to change the context altogether. And what's kind of interesting to me is that if that line, this very blunt line that I'm taking is correct, then it seems less appropriate to talk about adaptation or sensible food choices or anything like that. These are just the causes of these effects.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, but I actually do think there are always choices, right? It's just that some of them are so unthinkable that they're not even sensible. So for example, if you have very little money, you could eat 50 calories of kale a day. I mean, this would be a terrible choice. No one would do it, right? Because you wouldn't, on 50 calories a day, you'd soon waste away. But it is a logically possible choice. So I suppose really what I'm trying to say is, I mean, I think there is at least an implicit set of choices, but many of them are so obviously not sensible. The actually available ones, many of them are so obviously not sensible that it's certainly not blameworthy that you don't adopt them, right? So you could just not eat, right? Or you could, decide to not, well, the reproduction one is clearly a choice in some kind of a sense. I don't know how conscious a choice, we could talk about, but there are available options there. And the food ones, there are available options, but I guess the point about that story is many of the ones available are just not very attractive, right? And that you could just not eat, 4 days out of 7, but that's a really bad idea. That would be so I suppose I'm trying to undermine the force of the normative critique that poor people do silly things by saying, if you look at the set of realistically available ones, actually the ones they're not doing were the really silly ones, like not eating at all, or just, eating 50 calories worth of kale. But I think that the concept of other things are at least logically possible is important to my analysis. And I think that means, in a subtle way, that I don't think, so sociologists and kind of those critical of the capitalist system might describe many of the same causes as I do, in a more deterministic way. But for my analysis, it's logically important, this idea that the organism is quite active and is actually, selecting from a number of options available to it, and, would choose bad ones if the only other ones available are even worse than that. Yeah.
Do you mind if I follow up 2 seconds?
Sure.
Yeah, I like that. It's very nice thinking of the context of logical possibility. But then, right, you just now, what's interesting is that you've offered another kind of metric to think about this, because it may be logically possible for somebody to say, exert a lot of effort to go to a better food hub in another location, but that may make no difference in their abilities to make the decisions, because say they don't have the transport or the transportation to. Yeah, so I like what you just said, is that it offers, if you put it in that kind of scale, then logical possibility is really not very informative about how people behave, right? Or should in our analysis when we're evaluating that, to say that's logically possible for you to get up and go get a job somewhere else. No, that's not feasible in another sense, and you might say.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I also have quite a strong commitment to not de-agentizing people in poverty, right? So I think sometimes very deterministic things just sees sort of people in poverty as kind of just caught in these massive currents of, the economic system. And I'm just saying, well, they're not. They're active decision makers. They're just they're agents like you and me, but their choice set is just very different of what's kind of available to them and the relative cost to them of doing various things. But without stressing, they still do have agency, right? Or I like to conceptualize them that way. Otherwise, it becomes a very, we rich people have agency and we make choice, but poor people are just kind of the flotsam of larger tides. And I find that iniquitous.
Thank you.
Next, I believe Joshua or Josh, I'm not sure.
Yeah, Josh is fine. Thanks for this really interesting talk. So I find this really convincing that the behavior of the poor might be more rational than we might initially expect. But then as you work through your talk, you got towards the end and you started talking about interventions and the ineffective interventions, targeting teenage pregnancy and whatnot. And then it struck me, well, now you're charging the government interventions with being irrational. And what if the government interventions were secretly rational in the same way that the behavior of poor were secretly rational? And of course, I think they are irrational. I think there is a problem with the government interventions. And I think the behavior of the poor is probably more rational than we expect. So I don't really take that thought that seriously, but it does prompt the question, how do you distinguish between the genuinely irrational behaviors and the secretly rational behaviors? Is there anything principled that you can that would show us that the government interventions are really not secretly rational?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I actually don't have a very good answer, I have to confess, right? So and also there are times when people really are irrational and the government interventions are really good, like go and get your COVID vaccine, right? So there's a huge philosophical problem here, which is sometimes the people are wrong and the government is right, or whatever, or the sort of professionals are right. I suppose maybe something this kind of analysis can do is that every time we have an intervention or we're asked as researchers to comment on a potential intervention or a potential policy goal, we should just have this in mind. Yeah. Because I think that what we easily do is naturalize our own middle class choices, and they just seem self-evidently the right ones to us. Well, of course, everyone should live the way I live. Everyone should live like a college professor or whatever. And there's a lot of hidden normative content in that.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that's always wrong, but it's probably worth just pausing to think, hang on, is this an adaptive behavior? Might it make sense? Does it make sense in the lights of the people who are doing it, right? And just understand that a bit more before you kind of rush in. And I'm quite surprised, actually, given that social scientists were all meant to be super socially aware, how uncritical some papers I read about kind of public health interventions and so on are about that. It's like they just haven't done that step of thought. So maybe this is just a counter voice. It doesn't say all interventions are definitely always wrong, or I can even tell, right? I think that's a matter for probably reasonable people might disagree on. It might be quite hard to figure out, but at least this is a sort of perspective that ought to be taken on board before anyone rushes in.
Good, very nice. Thank you.
Daniel, I don't know if we want to take this question. Argon is a philosophy graduate student who I guess in another class had to leave and asked a question about abortion. That's a tricky one. Since he's not here, maybe we don't address that right now.
I mean, I've just
Yeah.
I just read his comment in the chat, and I mean, I think that's very interesting. And actually, what I would say to Argon Wahi here is there is a load of work on the uptake of abortion, and actually, there's lots of evidence that when people choose an abortion option versus some other option really depends where they are. So, if women who are relatively young fall pregnant, then their social class and job market prospects is a really strong predictor of whether they'll decide to abort, and then towards the end of their reproductive lives, so approaching the menopause, people become really less likely to abort. So they are making some kind of decisions about, the abortion has to fit in with their fertility plans or and where they are. So I think that you could think about abortion choices very much in the same kind of framework that I've been talking
Great.
about.
Next, Ted Kodacek from History.
Sorry, I have to unmute myself. So I actually would like to just sort of make some observations about the question you raised at the end about rule of thumb. And where this is coming from is that even though I'm a professor here, I've had a sort of strange experience with people of the type, or at least an N of one or one family of the type that you're talking about here. My wife and I were involved in foster care about 10, 12 years ago. And the child that we had went back to her family. And we actually kept up with them. So we've been keeping up with them for over a decade. And so I've had a chance to sort of see both how they act, but also to get some bit of a window into, I think, how they're thinking. And certainly their behavior very much conforms to what you're talking about. And I think the kind of analysis that you're making is absolutely correct about, in the context, this is very rational behavior. But in terms of, what is actually motivating this thinking, this is just an observation I've made. It's based on one case. It's, amateur. I'm not an anthropologist, but it seems to me that there has been a kind of a rule of thumb that I've been seeing operating. And the way I've characterized this to myself is that these are people who, for quite rational reasons, tend to think in 24-hour cycles. Mm-hmm. It's about, how am I going to get through the next day? That is the relevant question for them. And, when I compare the way they approach all sorts of problems with the way I approach it, for me, it's how I'm going to get through the next 20 years or, well, at this point, maybe it's too late for that, but certainly through much of my life, that's really, that is the framework in which I tend to think about choices that I should be making. And they don't really have that luxury because for them, really, it is a question of getting through the next 24 hours. So I think particularly in terms of the issues about food that you were talking about, that clearly is relevant. I think in terms of the issues about health behavior, perhaps less directly, but I think it's very much relevant in terms of why you make certain decisions as opposed to others about prioritizing. I think the case of reproductive behavior, maybe it is a little bit less clear, but I have some other thoughts about that.
Well, thanks for those observations. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. And also, I mean, I think that, for me, maybe an important point to stress about these kinds of issues is people like the family you describe are not different from you in some essential way, right? I bet I could put you in a situation, and I won't be able to, where you would start to think, how do I get through the next 24 hours? Right.
Well, that's how I came to this insight. I realized if I were in their situation, I would be doing exactly the same thing.
Right. But I mean, in a sense that certain kinds of big social upheaval, I think, were they to happen. I mean, maybe the pandemic in some ways has been an example, but imagine there were to be a war or something. That's how lots of us would start to think like that. And these things would probably, you'd find a lot of plasticity in how we are. And I think that's a really important kind of mental leap to make. That, imagine I was in a situation where I just had to get the next 24 hours. Would I really worry about, to some extent, although my work is sort of quantitative and based on all kinds of sources of official data and data that's aggregated and so on. It's all about understanding the context of individual people and seeing that, you know, were you in that context, you'd actually probably behave in a pretty similar way, or it would make sense to do so. So anyway, thanks for your observations.
Next question, Ritvik Agrawal, philosophy.
Hi, so I really enjoyed the talk, and I agree with, I think, a large chunk of your views. But I was thinking of Sendil Mullainathan's work on how poverty affects cognitive judgment and decision making and that kind of stuff. And it's empirical work, and yeah. And so, I mean, it doesn't necessarily go against the grain of what you're saying, but I still wanted to like kind of, you know, get your take on how you think it intersects with your argument, because it kind of is a follow-up also to what Andre was saying earlier, where it's not just about like the possibilities of choice, but like, you know, the conditions in which one exercises a choice. And Andre, of course, was talking about like external conditions, but Mullainathan has shown how, you know, poverty can also affect things internally in pretty serious ways. And that seems to be like also something which anecdotally we see with people when we talk to them. And Mullainathan's just kind of given empirical evidence for that.
Yeah, so, I mean, I've read his work, and particularly the book Scarcity. I think it's called Scarcity, isn't it? So in that book, I don't know whether rightly or not, I just took kind of two accounts of what's going on in his data that are both present in the book, and it never really seems to resolve which of them he's really talking about. So one account is, under scarcity, your priorities shift adaptively, and you know, you invest less in exactly what we've just been talking about. You invest in getting through the day, and you invest in tunneling on one thing, and this is actually an adaptive strategy, and that's fine. And I think that's very consistent with everything I'm arguing. But there's another version in the book, within the very same book, which is, when you've got too much scarcity going on, you can't make good decisions anymore, which is a pure kind of error thing. And no one else who's read this book seems to detect the same tension I detect, that in different passages, these two different takes on what it is seem to both be present. And I don't really know ultimately. When he sets out in the book, he seems to say, this is an adaptive thing. Under scarcity, you should tunnel down on the one problem you're trying to solve and kind of ignore the others. And later he seems to say, and under scarcity, they couldn't do this right because, you know, they were too stressed by their scarcity. And that seems to be an entirely different kind of explanation. So I think one reading of that stuff is really consistent with what I'm doing. But in the book, I found some odd slippages between whether it was really an adaptive account or a kind of, well, it's understandable, but just, you know, they end up making mistakes because the scarcity stresses them too much account.
Can I follow up with a question that I think is related, which is when we're talking about plasticity, are we talking about, and this is ultimately an empirical question, but I'm curious to know what you think about it. Is this the kind of, and one might know much better about the starlings, but is this a kind of plasticity that you think is always available at any point in the life history? Or is it a calibration at some stage with sensitivity and a diminishment of plasticity over time with some irreversibility built into it?
Yeah.
And related to that, how does that relate to, let's say, what an evolutionary psychologist might call some kind of, you know, evolution of EEA kind of argument? What was the range of environments for which this adaptive plasticity that you're talking about is adapted, and are modern environments mapping on correctly to those?
Yeah, well, that's two great questions. So I don't think I've got anything very definite to say about the second, but on the first, I think it's probably a mixture of a bunch of stuff, and it probably varies from domain to domain. I think evolutionary psychologists are oddly obsessed with these kind of lasting childhood, you know, in a critical period, you get this cue and then, you know, you're done and so on. And I don't dispute that those things probably exist. I wouldn't know anything about that. Yeah. No. I don't dispute that there's canalization and that development's really important, and that you lose plasticity as you get older. I don't dispute any of that. But I actually also think that there's just a lot of plasticity, right? I mean, economists would say there's a lot of immediate plasticity. The price of something goes up, you stop buying it. You know, so you don't have to sort of have the right childhood to do that. So I think it's probably a mixture of all kinds of things. And of course, some of it will be culturally transmitted, some of it will be kind of more like evoked culture. That's probably a mixture of different mechanisms that may be very different in different domains. And of course, that makes different predictions for the timescale of social change, potentially as ecological conditions change. Do you need a whole generation? Do you need 10 generations, or you just need 2 hours? So that's the first thing. The second thing I think is really interesting, and I don't have good answers about it. I mean, all I will say, I suppose, is that we're a very generalist species that's definitely evolved to be highly plastic and to be able to adapt through multiple means and multiple timescales to very different kinds of environments. And also, although clearly there are senses in which the modern environment is vastly different from conditions under which we evolved, things like figuring out what's good to eat, what you can get that you can eat, who you can mate with, when you might do that, how many children you should have. These are actually recurrent decisions. And of course, the context in which you're making them now are pretty weird, pretty odd. But I wouldn't go overboard with the sort of Stone Age mind in the fast lane kind of argument here, because I actually think people are pretty flexible, and that, of course, lots of the technologies and the choices people are making are different, but the fundamental issues are recurrent, historically recurrent ones. What do you eat?
Related to that, then, and you touched on this in your response, how much does culture matter? And a few kinds of things that I'm thinking of. One, when you mentioned an uptick in your model, an uptick of sugar consumption, I'm thinking of Sidney Mintz's book on Sweetness and Power, where, at least according to him, and I haven't looked at this, but the overconsumption of sugar, especially amongst certain classes, is a worse problem in England and its former colonies because of that colonial history of sugar production and consumption. That's one example. Another one, I'm thinking of Heidi Kolleran's work in rural Poland, looking at women's fertility decisions being heavily influenced by the education levels of those around them, not more so than their own personal circumstances. So how does culture fit into a lot of these kinds of stories?
Well, I mean, I think it fits in at least two ways. So partly, it's let's not assume there's a category called culture, but let's just say social transmission and so on forms part of the suite of mechanisms by which this plasticity is developed. And so Heidi's work, a lot of the things I showed were about neighborhood context and timing at reproduction, right? So, I mean, of course, that doesn't determine whether people are actually getting the information from their neighbors or just using their own, what they're using. But I have no problem with the idea that there's a huge amount of social transmission. I don't think it's I take a more dynamic view of culture than the kind of, you have to wait for random mutations of culture to come along, which could be hundreds of years. I think people, but people are using some sort of strategy where at least their first approximation is, well, what's everyone around me doing? And then they might experiment on top of that. And then so you might get quite rapid adaptation, but still a lot of social transmission. The other thing that culture does, of course, things like the prices of different foods are not exogenous. If sugar is cheap, partly because of a whole cultural history of, the sugar trade and the Atlantic slave trade and plantations and a whole load of things, right? So, the prices are not just facts of nature; they themselves are the outcome of processes. So, so culture, social transmission is definitely important, and culture broadly defined is important because it determines, what kind of options are available, and and what the prices of different things are and stuff like that.
We have more time for questions. Andre.
I just wanted to follow up, maybe a different approach on the culture. I was thinking about the model you were discussing about when you have scarcity of money and your food choices. You remember that model? And you were saying this is just a silicon model. I was thinking though, if we try to get real world data on it, maybe culture might creep up again. What I'm thinking about is immigrants to an affluent area. Right, and how that might affect this sort of stuff. And let me put the situation in from a different perspective. I remember reading Jeffrey Steingartner, who was a food critic for Vogue, and he wrote a couple books. One's called Must Have Been Something I Ate. The other is The Man Who Ate Too Much. In one of those books, he had a really interesting thing where he wanted to see what it would be like to live on food stamps in the United States. So he goes through that procedure and he gets these booklets, and most of them he notices is that there are a lot of recipes sponsored by Lipton, all these big corporations, Campbell and so forth. And so they make a recommendation about what to buy and it's all this stuff. And he sees how expensive it is. Then he says, well, let's go to a neighboring culture. You know, mine's Middle Eastern, my family's, you know, my relatives from Egypt. And there, the culture there of food, if you look at how they're eating and how they would handle the amount of money on food stamps, they do it a lot better because they do, you know, we do the couscouses and the more high grains and the high fibers. And so, right, so in one case, your culture is usurped, or maybe you don't, you know, usurped because there's a literature telling you what to do with this kind of thing. You're not familiar maybe with living in that level of poverty versus a immigration culture, an immigrant culture who really has handled this very, very well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't dispute that's right. I mean, in a sense, that's quite problematic for a strong version of my argument, because that what starts to creep in is about knowledge. It's about information. It's a really strong version of my argument. Just sort of says, you've just changed the amount of money available, and everyone, all humans, kind of, this is just what they have to do, and that, I mean, of course, that's an implausibly strong version of my claim, but at least it will be conceptually clear. But if you start saying, though it also depends on culture, and then you actually start thinking, well, actually some of these interventions, like giving people information about foods and stuff, start to seem more sensible again. You know, so because then you're saying, well, actually, if it is predominantly a matter of culture, you could change the culture by giving people cookery books and, you know, exposing them to different kinds of foods they might not be familiar with and so on. And whilst that's probably fine and probably true, it's a more traditional social science argument than I guess the claim I was trying to make. Though I have to concede it probably, you know, there's certainly something to it. What I would say, of course, is that you know, as I just mentioned before, the prices of different foods and what's available in the shops is not exogenous, right? That's also the product of human activity. It's not just like a fact of nature. And that gets my argument gets a bit muddy at that point. And my argument's best if you see what's available as just a sort of fact of nature, and then the people are all responding the same. If you start saying, well, actually, what's available is itself endogenous, then you need to model a much more complex kind of societal or cultural level process.
But I think, yeah, but those are operating on quite different timescales, so I think you're fine.
Of course.
As a model,
well, yeah.
You're fine.
Okay.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up on that. So I agree that, I mean, culture sometimes plays a role, for example, the kind of example that Andre had. But I can, like, you know, it's very easy to also construct examples which go more with your model. So for example, Indian immigrants who move to the US, right? They eat a lot more meat in the US just because of availability, and it's much cheaper than in India. And it has been recorded that, like, you know, if you, like, kids move like really early on, their average height, for example, is much more than it would be in India. So, I mean, it's easy to construct examples which go with your point about like availability and finances and making food cheaper and that kind of stuff as well. It's not just the cultural point.
Yeah, but I think the really strong test in a way for me would be that if amongst immigrants you get wealth related differences within the immigrants, you know, all coming from a homogenous cultural background that correspond to my pattern. So that would be kind of a strong test of the kind of causal claims I make.
Yeah.
I'm
like to just quickly add to that, like I mean, like just, you know, it's in the spirit of what you just said, people from various cultural backgrounds from India, which obviously differ really like in huge ways, right? When they come to the US, this pattern has been observed across those backgrounds where the kids just are like, you know, have like more robust health and like a greater average height and those kind of factors. So it seems to kind of go beyond just culture, even just on those grounds.
Thank you. Did Josh Rust have his hand up, or is that still?
I think it's still.
Oh no, sorry, I meant to put that
okay.
down. Thanks.
I have a technical question. I hope this is okay.
Yeah.
In your model with extrinsic mortality, where you had like M equals 0.1, I'm assuming that's a 1% per time period.
Yeah.
So it's a fixed exogenous probability of dying each period, and then you're modeling. How much I've wondered about this stuff. I mean, every model I've ever done in reciprocity uses the exact same assumption, but it gives rise to a very weird pattern, which is lifespans are distributed exponentially, which could be true for a deep sea clam or a lobster, maybe a vampire, but most vertebrates, including humans, don't have exponentially distributed lifespans. They have lifespans that look very differently. So I don't know, I've never really thought about it, especially in this kind of context where you're modeling an adaptive response embedded within this extrinsic mortality, but how much does it, I know it's weird in the reciprocity models, but how do you think that makes a difference?
In the reciprocity models, is at the end of the interaction that's distributed that way. So it's like you don't know how long the interaction is going to last.
Correct. Yeah, your social, the length of your social relationships are distributed exponentially. Yeah. Correct.
Yes. So I mean the truth is, I just did it that way, Karthik, because it's easy.
It's fine. Everybody, it's easy to do, and I've done the same thing.
That's right. Yeah. It probably matters, but I mean, I think there are lots of ways in which that model is more a sort of slight formalization of something that's intuitively.
I think that's correct. Yeah. I'm not.
I mean, I'm not kind of, in a sense, its biological accuracy is sort of less important than the fact that the intuition works. Now,
correct.
Unfortunately, in this area, as you know about George C. Williams' argument, intuition is often wrong. Okay, it's often things it seems intuitively must be true, but I think in this case, if you assume that, I mean, I think particularly the model works well if you assume that there are some things happening. They don't even have to be the sole source of mortality, but they do happen. Sort of basically shocks happen, and they happen at different rates for different individuals or different sectors of the population. Then the model's quite good for capturing why their behavior would qualitatively be different. I don't think there's no quantitative prediction from this model, right? It's just a sort of qualitative illustration. So,
and if anything, you might get, a period of the lifespan in which all your results hold. And then perhaps towards the end of lifespans, when everything gets compressed, everybody starts smoking. And
there's lots of that model is very, so in that model, you have to decide on the day you're born how much effort you're going to invest in your whole life, right? In health behavior, or whether you're going to do something. So I mean, there's all sorts of ways in that behavior in which that model is not accurate, not realistic, I should say.
Yeah. Jake Young, English and Poetry.
Thanks. Really interesting talk. I have a question, kind of a two-parter, but I think that it's related. Is on one of the last slides that you had, you brought up kind of this idea of context blindness and then the fundamental attribution error. And it really seems to me that the fundamental attribution error is in many ways like one of the main reasons for this type of context blindness. Which also, though, I think perhaps might relate to the idea of the difference between the rational and the adaptive behavior that you were talking about at the very beginning. And where I'm going with this is that it seems to me that we often think of rational behavior as conscious, but adaptive behavior as something that is non-conscious. And same thing we have here with this fundamental attribution error, where we're taking something that we are maybe thinking is done consciously, but could perhaps be non-conscious behavior. We're attributing this type of conscious behavior to it, and then missing the entire context of what's actually been happening. The other side of that, though, is the context blindness you presented was really from the side of the observer, right? We're looking at this data, we're trying to figure out the context for it. But also, could there not be context blindness and fundamental attribution error from the other side? Say people who, take the comic that you had, are going, yeah, we might be, in a war, so who cares about drugs? But that's a short-sighted view of this immediate situation, but without the larger context of, yeah, but if this war ends and we get out of here, we probably shouldn't have been doing all those drugs.
Yeah, no, sure. And I suppose I'm not wedded to saying that all poor people are super rational and have always got everything right. But I suppose I'm wedded to saying, as a starting point, let's not assume that they're less rational, have got more things wrong. Okay, that I'm just as likely to be the one who's misapprehending, my context. just to come back to your conscious, non-conscious, adaptive, rational thing, I'm not sure I buy into any kind of 2x2 table that puts sort of adaptive and unconscious together and rational and conscious. I think, I mean, in economic definitions of rationality, you can be rational without being conscious, you know, because rationality is about kind of the consistency of your decisions and so on. And also, I think you can, you know, evolutionary psychologists love these kind of implicit kind of things that we have that maybe have some adaptive. But I think actually one of the main ways that humans behave adaptively is by really thinking hard about it, you know, doing things. So I'm not sure I sort of would make the distinction between, you know, rational is conscious, whereas adaptive is, I mean, adaptive seems to be about consequences. And actually rationality in the economic definition of rationality is kind of about consequences too. Like, you know, is it consistent? Does it lead to intransitivities? Does it work with respect to the goal that you're trying to maximize? Those kinds of things. So when I say rational, I don't necessarily mean that people could sit down and do the actuarial calculation and say, and therefore, ergo, this is the right thing to do. I just mean something that's kind of broadly consistent with their goals, I guess. I'm not sure that really answered your comment, but anyway.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question. Sukhvinder Shahi, philosophy.
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk. I have a question that's pertaining to a response that you gave to one of the questions on the work on scarcity. So I wasn't sure if you were saying that the two kind of claims that the authors are making there are not compatible, because the way I see it, it's all right to say that that agents are rational within the constraints that they're making, but they're not fully free in the sense that the constraints also affect their adaptive preferences. So I don't, maybe I got you wrong, but were you saying they're incompatible? Because as I see it,
I found the book incoherent because I felt that it slipped between two takes. I don't dispute what you just said, by the way. You know, what you said is right, but I felt the book slipped between, for me, it apparently slipped or was insufficiently clear between two different kinds of claims. One, which is under scarcity, you develop a different set of preoccupations or goals, and that's right. That's what you should do under scarcity. And the other is under scarcity, people start to do dumb things. And I felt they slipped incoherently between these two things. And I think their data support the former. I think it's hard, you know, probably more than the latter. But I just, for me personally, and maybe I didn't read it carefully enough, or, you know, but that's my problem with that book. I didn't feel they were sufficiently clear about which of these two things they were making. But anyway, maybe I'm wrong, you know.
Yeah, what I'm saying is I don't find those both, I mean, authors could make the both claims and still be coherent, because the second claim seems to be a corollary of what they're saying, that not given those constraints, those choices would seem dumb or something like that.
No, and that's definitely right. I definitely agree. But I felt there were times in the book where they were saying, okay, even given those constraints, those choices are still dumb, but people are so stressed they can't see that. Okay, which would be a very different kind of a claim. Maybe that my reading of the book was too hasty, or you know, I just didn't get what they were trying to say. But for me, it seemed at times they were saying, God, under scarcity, we really do some dumb things that are just obviously not in our interests, which is different from saying, under scarcity, we do things which are the things we have to do under scarcity, but in a non-scarce situation would not be optimal. And you know, I felt that they slipped around on that continuum a bit for me.
Devil in the details.
Yeah, well,
maybe something to the entire category and saying some mistakes are, or some things, some choices are really dumb and some are maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, so maybe it was just my reading of the book. As I say, that I felt that was, to me, was a kind of uncertainty within it, quite where they landed on that particular thing.
Great. All right, Daniel, thank you so much. This was great.